Good morning. It's such an honor to be part of this symposium, especially among some great scholars of World War II. I am not a scholar of World War II. However, you'll see in the program, I'm right in the middle of the presentations. So if you would think of this symposium as sort of a fine dining experience, I'm sort of the palate cleanser, right? The little stuff you have before the next meal, to the sort of the main courses that these fine historians are talking about D-Day. So I'm here to bring a curator's perspective to D-Day through the artifacts that we have on display in our World War II gallery. And some of you may have been to the museum and been through our gallery and seen them, or some for the first time today. And then later on in the afternoon, you're going to get a chance, a sneak peek at the new D-Day exhibit that we just opened, or we're going to open to the public tomorrow. But before I get to those objects, I want to take some time to discuss the photo that you see up on the screen. And I really appreciate Dr. McManus talking through it. He gives a lot of great context to kind of what I'm going to be talking about. And it will flow very nicely into my presentation about beach obstacles. So many might recognize this photo. It's a rather famous photo, among others, taken by Robert Capa on June 6, 1944. This photo is part of a collection known as the Magnificent 11, although I heard there's maybe 10 or 9 photos. And it's called that because only 11 of these photos survived. He was on assignment for Life magazine, and he landed early in the assault. There's a little debate as to when he landed or what time he landed, when he captured this photograph. So interviews with him afterwards, he mentioned that he took over 100 photos. But the lab technicians in the dark room overheated the negatives, and they were damaged, and only these 11 remain. And this is one of them. Now, Capa immediately found himself in the middle of the action and frenetically started taking photographs. The first images are from the landing craft as soldiers were getting off and heading to the shore. The next set of photos are from the opposite perspective you see here. More than likely, he took this photo when he was taking cover behind one of the tanks that was already on the shore. As you can see, soldiers seeking protection behind this beach obstacle. So this image shows 4 soldiers of the 16th Infantry Regiment pinned down behind a beach obstacle known as a hedgehog. The helmet with the white arc worn by the soldier on the left indicates that he was a combat engineer. These obstacles were placed by the Germans to deter landing crafts from getting on shore. However, as you see here, they became temporary shields for American soldiers facing mortar and small arms fire. This image and others like it are very sort of a powerful reminder of what these soldiers went through in the first harrowing hours of D-Day. So under the direction of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the German army began construction and placing obstacles along the Normandy coast in preparation for the invasion. He believed that the sea itself was the best defensive barrier, as well as the terrain around Omaha Beach. In total, there were over 3,700 obstacles at Omaha Beach, the highest density of any D-Day beaches. Now, you see here in this image what is known as hedgehog. We have this on display on the left photo there in our gallery. And this originated in Czechoslovakia in 1935, and it was used originally as border protection by Germany. And it was designed both as anti-aircraft and also an anti-tank obstacle. And it's sort of crudely made. It's from steel, angles, and rails that forms this X. And it was a very, very powerful or very, very successful, I should say, in keeping light and medium tanks and vehicles from entering a line of defense. The Hedgehog was also used by Russia during the Second World War in anti-tank defense as well. In fact, today, hedgehogs of all types are used in the current war in Ukraine. In fact, I read an article where these World War II hedgehogs were brought out from a museum and used as a roadblock in Kiev to deter Russian vehicles. So it's kind of old is new again, but it just tells you how formidable and how effective these type of obstacles are. Now we look at what the Allies referred to as a Belgian gate. Probably seen images of this on the beach. They're also called Element C. The Germans actually call them Pointet gates because it's named after Leon Edmond de Pointet, who's a French officer who essentially invented these. They would have been positioned on the outer barrier of about 100 yards above the low tide mark and roughly 270 yards from the seawall. These gates were also used inland to prevent tank from advancing along the road. They were very, very effective and very difficult to take apart. Now, what you see here is just the front section, as there are many components to this gate made from mostly steel rebar and plates. So we only could fit sort of the front section on the display, but it gives you a very sort of that powerful image that you see in the other historic photos. This is probably one of the more formidable obstacles, what is known as a tetrahedron. They also called it a pyramid trap. It's made from reinforced concrete, and they were mostly designed for anti-tank obstacles. They were very, very heavy and almost impossible to turn over. As you can see just from the design, it's fairly basic, however, very difficult to turn over, and it was very, very effective against tanks. Now, there wasn't as many of these type of obstacles during the Normandy invasion. I saw a report that on Gold Beach, there were about 45 of these compared to about 655 hedgehogs. So it gives you an idea of how much was used. Now, all these beach obstacles that I mentioned have become somewhat iconic, right? When you see them, you know what they are, you know what they represent. Through photographs, through movies, they kind of resonate with us in a very powerful way. But to the sailors who had to navigate the boats through the obstacles, they became very formidable deterrents to overcome. To the soldiers who were responsible for demolishing them, became an important part of their job that allowed more boats to land on D-Day. To the soldiers who used them as shields when they stormed the beaches, it became their only protection. And to the soldiers who then reused the steel to outfit tanks to cut through those hedgerows, it became a necessary tool. So I just find it so interesting that these beach obstacles can hold such power, right? And meaning not only for the soldiers who fought on D-Day, but for us as we commemorate the 80th anniversary. And now we're going to get to a helmet that was associated with a soldier who landed on D-Day. This object is M1C helmet. It was worn by Captain William Byrd, who you see there on the left. Dr. McManus talked about some of the things that they did prior to D-Day to kind of stress relief. Well, here he is. You see him playing football. This was on June 5th. So it just gives you a good illustration of what he was talking about. So it's an olive drab helmet with the white diamond, as you can see, painted on the side of the helmet, indicating that he's with the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. The two white stripes, of course, are painted in the front, indicating the rank of captain. And the Army began fielding these type of helmets, or fielding new helmets known as M1s, to provide increased protection to troops during World War II. But these helmets were not suitable for airborne troops because the helmet could easily come off when the parachute deployed. So the M1C was developed specifically for parachutists. It featured a different chin strap, modified attachment points for the chin strap, which was more secure for the helmet. So Captain Byrd's first combat jump was during the landings at Normandy as part of Operation Overlord. When he landed, he suffered a sprained ankle, as many soldiers did. While attempting to get to an aid station, he was actually captured by German soldiers. Later on, he was liberated by American soldiers and then reassigned back to the regimental headquarter company of the 501st. Then once again, he jumped on 17 September with the 1st Battalion near a castle in Holland. Now, Captain Byrd remained behind at the castle with the wounded and was organizing supplies. This is when Germans approached the castle and he was killed in a skirmish by an overwhelming force. This is the helmet that he was wearing when he died. There is a shrapnel hole in the rear neckline of the helmet, and he's buried in the Netherlands American Cemetery in Margrein, Netherlands. Now I'd like to talk about Martin Teehan and his M1 rifle. It's an interesting story. He was a 20-year-old kid from the Bronx, and he jumped into Normandy on D-Day, and he was with the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division. Now, shortly after he landed, he was killed in action. And there are some conflicting reports as to when he died. Eyewitnesses claimed he was killed immediately by a German sniper. However, the War Department report lists his date of death as 23 June. And also the report of burial states that on 7 July 1944 at 1300, Teehan was buried in the temporary U.S. military cemetery in France. He was buried in his uniform, and his identification tags were attached to the marker. And on his body at the time were a cigarette lighter, his parachutist badge, and souvenir coins. Now, Operation Overlord was the code name given to the battle for Normandy and the Allied operation that launched the successful invasion of German-occupied Western Europe. Mission Boston was the code name given to the nighttime parachute combat assault by Major General Matthew Ridgway's 82nd Airborne Division. Now, roughly 6,500 paratroopers jumped from nearly 370 aircraft, an intended objective area of roughly 10 square miles, 5 hours ahead of the D-Day beach landings. The 507th, the 508th infantry regiments were given the mission of blocking approaches west of the Meurthe River, dropping just north of the town of Picqueville in France. Now, on the night of 5 June 1944, the 508th left England from 2 different airfields as part of Force A, and they were dropped onto French soil between the hours of 0208 and 0220 on 6 June 1944. The majority missing their intended target due to bad weather and German aircraft fire. So the M1 Garand that you see here was discovered 72 years later, and it was identified as Private Teehan's rifle. If you look closely, it might be hard to see, but inscribed on the butt of the rifle is his last name, Teehan. Now, this was the rifle that he jumped with on D-Day. So in 2016, a descendant of the French farmer who found the rifle gave it to Colonel Patrick Collette. He was a French Army paratrooper. Later that year, it was gifted to General Mark Milley, then the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. General Milley then transferred this rifle to the museum, which we now have on display. Now, of course, the M1 rifle is an extremely important weapon, as we know, used by American soldiers. But what sets this rifle apart, that is, it survived and today kind of symbolizes what soldiers like Private Teehan went through. And it also inspired his family, his nephew, to write a book about Tian. He called him Uncle Matty. And the amazing story of kind of bringing this rifle back to the United States. And it's an interesting piece to look at. What you can't see on the rifle, that is on the back, is the word Kitty, or the name Kitty. We don't know who Kitty is. Perhaps it's the nickname for the rifle, perhaps a girlfriend, perhaps somebody back home. We're not sure. So a lot of research kind of went into to try to identify Kitty, but we couldn't find anything substantial. Now, of course, I could not talk about D-Day without mentioning the Higgins boat. It was mentioned a few times in the previous speakers, and here is the one that we have on display in the museum. It is an original landing craft, one of only 8 that can be linked to World War II and or the D-Day landings in Normandy. We do not know what beach this boat landed. We don't know when it landed. But the boat was discovered on the Isle of Wight in England and then transported to Virginia, where it underwent a lot of restoration. These boats, when they were built, they weren't really made to last. They were very expendable, and a lot of them obviously were lost, not only during the war, but after the war as well. So in the exhibit, we interpret soldiers from the 4th Infantry Division landing at Utah Beach as part of the second wave of attacks. We use realistic cast figures. If you get to the galleries later, you can see how realistic they are. And to show a lot how the soldiers climb down from the nets from the larger ships into the smaller boats underneath. Some basic facts about the boat: it weighed about 8,000 pounds. Its top speed was 12 knots. And could carry about 36 soldiers, or 1 jeep and 12 equipped soldiers. It manned a crew of 3, usually Coast Guard or Navy personnel. And then there's records indicate that over 23,000 Higgins boats were made for World War II, made by 7 different companies. And we know it was developed by Andrew Higgins, whose company Higgins Industries was located in New Orleans. Now, if you go to the World War II Museum, National World War II Museum in New Orleans, you'll see a Higgins boat. It's not an original. It's a replica inside the lobby of the museum. It's quite interesting. So, as I said, there was only 8. The Navy Museum has one. There's a few overseas in England and in France. And there's a few other locations in the States as well. As I mentioned before, a lot of them did not survive the war. A lot of them were scrapped or just did not make it afterwards. You will notice that there are a lot of Higgins boats in this country, but a lot of them were made after World War II, especially 1950s as well. But the LCVP, as it's known, was first tested in 1941. And in the Eastern Theater, they were an integral part of North Africa, Sicily, Salerno, southern France, and of course, Normandy. And then even in the Pacific, they saw action in the Solomon Islands, Tarawa, Luzon in the Philippines, of course, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Now, after World War II, these boats were modified and saw some service also into the 1950s. Now, the Higgins boat design is pretty simple. However, it revolutionized how troops and equipment moved into hostile territory. The boat could operate in a little as 2 feet of water, and the ramp, that sort of allowed for soldiers to rush directly into combat. And the boat could quickly reverse to load more soldiers and equipment. Now, of all the objects tied to D-Day, I would argue that the Higgins boat is the most iconic, right? The images that we see, the videos and movies that we see of the ramp lowering down, and then soldiers storming the beaches under heavy fire, is sort of embedded in our minds when we think of D-Day. And so I kind of began my talk with an image, and I would like to kind of end my presentation with another famous image. I think everyone here probably has recognized, have seen before, maybe the most famous photograph from D-Day. It wasn't taken by Robert Capa. It was taken by Chief Photographer's mate, Robert Sargent. And this was at 7:40 a.m., where troops offloaded towards the Easy Red section of Omaha Beach. Now, the title of this photo, you may know, is Taxis to Hell and Back into the Jaws of Death. The title is sort of inspired by Lord Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. And I think it's very, it kind of fits this image. Now, as I mentioned, it depicts American soldiers from the United States Army's 1st Infantry Division coming off the Higgins boat. And this boat, very similar to the one we have on display. Now, if you were looking at this image simply from an aesthetic perspective or from a photographer's point of view, is an extremely well-composed photo. You can see the leading lines of the boat's hull. It's kind of drawing your attention or your focus on the soldiers who are trudging through the water. You also get a sense of where they're going, and the beach and what lies ahead, as which we know the German army ready to cut them down. And then from a military perspective, it reveals sort of the treacherous environment, the swelling waves, the strong tide, which took a lot of these boats off course and into more dangerous situations. And as we taught, D-Day and the battles afterwards are often discussed, and Professor McManus talked a little bit about it, in a very mythical way, right? Trying to overcome a powerful force to secure a very important victory. And the objects, the soldier stories that I presented, I think offer a glimpse into what it was like for soldiers on D-Day. However, it cannot replicate the feelings, the emotions, the physical and mental hardships of what they went through. It could only offer a picture of what it was like 80 years ago. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. We do have time for some questions. We have any questions from folks about what we've seen the artifacts? Got one up front.
It's super quick. Does the engine run on your...
It does not run.
I just wondering, what other mechanical features still function correctly? Does it still have, like steering control or rudder control or things?
It does have steering wheel and control. The engine does not work or anything like that. But it did go. It had to be heavily restored. But folks who have come to kind of study it have clearly indicated that it is up from the World War II time period, because there are different variants, there are different components that indicate from what time period this came from. So.
Other questions? Yeah, oh, go here first.
Again, a quick one. You said these weren't very durable. Were they one and done, or how often were they used?
Well, I think I've read accounts where they drop off, go back, and get more. Reading in terms of how, they were kind of not meant to last. I would just put it that way. So they were built quickly. They were built to get the job done. They weren't not necessarily built for endurance to that degree, but they were extremely effective in getting the mission accomplished.
One up front here.
I have a question about Robert Capa. I have read that he became so terrified that he left the battle scene.
Yes, I'm glad. I was going to go into that. So there are different accounts. Of course, his account was that he was there in H hour, 0630, Easy Company, 16th Infantry Regiment. There's some sort of critique of that where he may have came later, based on the photographs that he took in terms of where the tide was at the time. So there are other accounts that he was there at 7:30 and left at 8:30. So he may not have had the time to take the 100 photographs that he said he did. And so he may have said maybe to blame the poor lab technicians, which, by the way, Life magazine folks said that never happened. And because of that, because he was in the mix and he was right there, and he wanted to get out of there early. However, saying all that, he still was in the thick of it. He was still taking some powerful photos under heavy fire, and he captured, I think, some of the most iconic moments of D-Day. But yes, there is maybe some holes in his story, but I don't think it takes away from what he did.
I mean, it was just the missing 89 photographs. That's very suspicious to me.
Yeah. Thank you.
How much do you have in the way of personal artifacts carried by men, and what do you think is the most poignant one you have?
Well, I mentioned a few of them. I think T-Hands rifles is kind of important. There are other objects we have directly related to D-Day on display. There's a cricket, the signaling device that troop, and we have it ID'd to an actual soldier, a quartermaster soldier, actually. So that kind of resonates with me. But I would argue that T-Hands rifle is powerful because you can connect with it. He inscribed it. So obviously he had a personal connection with the rifle as well. So that for me, that's one of the most important ones.
Okay, we got one from our virtual audience.
Yeah. Where are they?
One of the volunteers at the Marine Corps Museum said the boats were open in part because the closed ones were making soldiers ill with exhaust fumes. Were there any other reasons for those being open?
Open, meaning in terms of the tops? Okay. I think it was, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if that was why they're open at the top. Does anyone else have an idea? I think it was just really to get the soldiers off quickly, for not them to be in a confined space. It did produce a lot of diesel fumes, but I'm not sure if that's the exact reason why it's open. Loading them would be hard. That's true.
Any other questions?
I get the impression that nobody was really thinking much about preserving these right after the war for posterity. What is the condition of preserving artifacts, or the policy today? Do you think it's that we're doing a better job with that?
Absolutely. We have, not only within the Army, but we work very closely with conservators. In fact, the boat that we have downstairs was essentially found and kind of identified by a conservation company. So we do a much better job today, first identifying historic objects, although I think the Army could do much more, but also in not only identifying, but figuring out ways to properly conserve it. There are a lot of specialists out there that we consult with, a lot of work that we can sometimes contract out to those specialists who can look at water-damaged Higgins boat or whatever the case may be, and take the necessary steps to preserve it so we can study it and learn from it.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks, Sean.